The cast iron skillet was still hot from dinner when I used it to crack a man's ribs. My laptop sat on the counter, the screen showing a live video of my husband in a nursery 300 miles away. He wasn't alone. He was kissing a woman who looked exactly like my neighbor. But that wasn't the part that stopped my heart. I had just found the bank records. David didn't just leave me. He stole my entire life, every cent of my inheritance, and moved it into a shell company registered in my name. I have exactly 40 minutes before the local sheriff arrives to arrest me for a $50 million federal fraud I didn't commit. My phone is dead. My bank accounts are frozen. And the man David hired to kill me is currently bleeding out on my kitchen floor, while I'm holding the only evidence that can save me. I thought I knew who I married. I was wrong. Let me take you back to the moment I bypassed the final firewall. The silver key bit into Sarah's palm as she gripped the steering wheel. Rain drummed against the windshield of her parked sedan, blurring the neon sign of the Riverside Motel into a bleeding red smear. Her husband's scent, sandalwood and expensive scotch, lingered in the leather upholstery, mocking the crumpled receipt she discovered in his tuxedo jacket. She stepped onto the asphalt, her heels clicking a jagged rhythm against the pavement. The air smelled of wet earth and exhaust. Room 212 sat at the end of the flickering outdoor corridor. Sarah reached the door, her breath hitching. She expected the perfume of a younger woman or the muffled sounds of a betrayal. Instead, a low, rhythmic weeping seeped through the thin wood. Sarah slid the key into the lock. It turned with a metallic snap. Inside, the room lacked the heat of a tryst. A woman sat on the edge of the floral bedspread, clutching a threadbare blanket around her shoulders. She didn't jump or scream. She looked up, her eyes rimmed with a dull, exhausted red. "You took your time," the woman whispered, her voice cracking like dry parchment. Sarah's gaze drifted to the nightstand. A stack of legal documents sat beside a half-eaten sandwich. These weren't love letters. She recognized her own signature on the top page, a forgery so precise it made her stomach churn. "Is he coming?" the woman asked, shivering. Sarah stepped into the room, the heavy scent of bleach and mildew stinging her nose. "He isn't coming for either of us." The silence that followed was heavy, punctuated only by the relentless ticking of Sarah's watch. She didn't look at the woman again. Her focus shifted to the task at hand. The auditor of souls had work to do. Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out her laptop, the matte black casing cold against her fingertips. She sat at the small, laminate desk, her posture as rigid as a ruler. The screen glowed, casting a pale blue light over her thin-rimmed glasses. She didn't think about the betrayal yet. She didn't think about the sandalwood scent or the red smear of the motel sign. She thought about the numbers. The ledger of her life was out of balance, and she was the only one who could fix the tally. Part 1. A heap of trouble. Sarah's fingers danced across the keyboard with a speed born of 1,000 late nights at the firm. The air in the motel room felt thick, tasting of stale cigarette smoke and the sharp, chemical tang of cheap floor cleaner. She ignored the woman on the bed, instead focusing on the digital walls she needed to dismantle. The Guardian Link app, the very security system David had bragged about installing for the firm, stood between her and the truth. She didn't use the standard entry points. She looked for the cracks, the small inconsistencies in the code that mirrored the inconsistencies in David's stories. The fan of the laptop began to whir, a low mechanical hum that vibrated through the desk and into her forearms. With a final, sharp strike of the enter key, the barrier gave way. It wasn't like a door opening, it was like a dam bursting. The data flooded the screen. Thousands of lines of transactions, color-coded and time-stamped. Sarah's eyes moved in a practiced grid pattern. Her breathing slowed to a rhythmic count. 904, 905, 906. She wasn't looking for love letters or secret messages. She was looking for the money. She found it tucked away in a series of nested accounts, a shell corporation named Blue Ridge Holdings. The name was a mockery, a reference to the mountains where they'd spent their honeymoon. She watched as the numbers shifted. David hadn't just been skimming, he had been siphoning. Her entire inheritance, the money her mother had left her, the fund Sarah had guarded like a sacred trust, was being drained. It was a systematic execution of her financial life. The balance didn't just drop, it plummeted, leaving a trail of zeros that looked like hollow eyes staring back at her. The debt she felt she owed the world had just been doubled by the man who was supposed to help her carry it. Subverted. Sarah felt a strange, cold clarity. She had the evidence. This was the logical next step. Find the destination. If the money was moving to Blue Ridge Holdings, she needed to know who was behind the curtain. She used her administrative access to bypass the final security layer of David's private vault. She expected to find bank routing numbers, perhaps a list of co-conspirators at the firm. Her reasoning was sound. David was a creature of greed, and greed always left a paper trail. The screen flickered, then stabilized. A live video feed popped up, grainier than the rest of the interface. Sarah leaned in, her glasses slipping slightly down the bridge of her nose. It wasn't a bank. It was a room. A nursery, painted a soft, mocking blue. The camera was tucked into the corner of the ceiling, providing a wide-angle view of a crib, a rocking chair, and a changing table. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, uneven rhythm. 907, 908. "He's there," she whispered. The relief was a physical weight lifting off her chest. She had him. She could call the police, show them the feed, and end this. She watched as a figure entered the frame, David. He looked different without the suit jacket. His sleeves rolled up, his expression softened in a way she hadn't seen in years. He leaned over the crib and picked up a small, bundled shape. He looked happy. He looked like the man she had married, before the lies had turned him into a stranger. Behind her, Martha Wilson, who had followed Sarah into the room under the guise of borrowing a suitcase, let out a sharp, strangled gasp. Sarah didn't turn around. She was mesmerized by the image of her husband playing father in a house she didn't recognize. "Look at him," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mix of triumph and agony. "I have the location. I have the proof of the life he's been hiding." Then the crack happened. A woman walked into the video feed. She was younger, with piercing blue eyes and a nervous habit of smoothing her hair behind her ears. She walked up to David, and he didn't flinch. He didn't pull away. He leaned down and kissed her with a familiar, easy intimacy that made Sarah's stomach turn to lead. Martha's hand flew to her mouth, the dried rosebud she always carried falling to the floor with a soft, unnoticed thud. "Chloe?" Martha whispered, her voice cracking. Sarah froze. "You know her?" "That's my sister," Martha sobbed, her entire torso deflating as she sank into the floral bedspread. "That's Chloe. She disappeared 5 years ago. We thought she was gone. Sarah, he didn't just build a secret life. He stole my sister to do it." The reveal hit Sarah like a physical blow to the solar plexus. The nursery wasn't just a hidden apartment. It was a fortress of a much larger betrayal. She hadn't just found a mistress. She had found a kidnapping of the soul. And because she had bypassed the security, A red alert began to flash on the corner of the screen. GPS active. Signal broadcasting. She hadn't just found him. She had told him exactly where she was. The sound of tires screaming against asphalt cut through the rain. Sarah lunged for the laptop, but the door to the motel room didn't just open, it exploded inward. A man in a dark trench coat, his face a mask of professional indifference, stepped over the threshold. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The air suddenly smelled of wet wool and the metallic tang of a weapon. This wasn't a conversation. It was a recovery mission. The mercenary moved with a predatory grace, his eyes locked on the laptop. Sarah didn't scream. Her mind, conditioned by years of tracking errors, immediately calculated the distance between her and the small kitchenette. She dived. The man lunged, his fingers grazing the fabric of her coat. But Sarah was faster. Her hand closed around the handle of a heavy cast-iron skillet left on the stove by a previous tenant. The metal was cold and greasy, but it felt like a lifeline. As the man swung a heavy fist, Sarah pivoted, swinging the skillet with every ounce of repressed rage she possessed. The clang of iron hitting bone was sickeningly loud in the small room. The man grunted, his head snapping back as he stumbled into the laminate table. "Get out!" Sarah hissed at Martha, who was frozen in terror. Sarah didn't wait to see if she'd knocked him out. She grabbed the laptop, the power cord trailing behind her like a tail, and scrambled for the back door. The mercenary was already pushing himself up, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Sarah slammed the door shut and threw the bolt just as his shoulder hit the wood. She ran for her car, the rain blinding her, the wind whipping her hair into her eyes. The garage door of the motel's small parking structure was halfway down, a mechanical mouth closing. Sarah dived through the gap, the rough concrete scraping her palms, and rolled toward her sedan. She could hear the man's heavy boots hitting the pavement behind her. She fumbled with the keys, the silver metal slick with rain and sweat. The engine roared to life, a beautiful mechanical snarl. She didn't look back as she reversed out of the space, the tires spinning on the wet floor before catching. She caught a glimpse of the man in the rearview mirror, his trench coat fluttering like wings as he disappeared into the darkness. She had the laptop. She had the address in Richmond. But as she accelerated onto the main road, the auditor of souls realized she was no longer just looking for a discrepancy. She was running for her life. Part 2. Double Trouble. The highway was a ribbon of black glass under the relentless downpour. Sarah's hands were clamped onto the steering wheel, her knuckles white. She kept the laptop open on the passenger seat, the screen's glow the only light in the cabin. Every few seconds, she glanced at her phone, waiting for a signal, a message. Anything from the world she used to inhabit. The crack came quietly. The bars of signal at the top of her phone screen didn't just drop, they vanished. She tapped the screen, her breath hitching. No service. She tried to open her banking app, desperate to see if she had enough for a hotel, for gas, for a way to disappear. Account deactivated. Contact system administrator. The words were a death sentence. David wasn't just following her. He was erasing her. He was the administrator. He held the keys to her digital existence, and with a few keystrokes, he had turned her into a ghost. She was a woman with a car and a laptop. But in the eyes of the world, Sarah Miller no longer existed. No money, no phone, no identity. She pulled into a gas station, the fluorescent lights overhead flickering with a dying, buzzing sound. The air smelled of gasoline and cheap coffee. She tried her credit card at the pump, but the machine spat it back out with a sharp, mechanical beep that sounded like a taunt. "Please," she whispered to the plastic slot, "just let me have $20. The machine remained silent. Sarah looked at her reflection in the dark window of the station. She looked like a stranger. Hair matted, eyes wide and rimmed with red, her glasses crooked. She was counting again. 1,102. 1,103. The apology log was growing. She was sorry she hadn't seen it. She was sorry she had been so arrogant to think she could outsmart him from a motel room. She got back into the car, the engine sputtering as if it too was losing the will to fight. She checked the synced GPS on the dashboard. David's marker, a small, predatory red dot, wasn't at the airport. It wasn't in Chicago, it was moving. Fast. It was heading toward Richmond, carving a path through the map that would intercept her own. He had never intended to leave. The business trip was a ruse, a way to get her out of the house so he could finalize the transition. The road ahead was empty. A desolate stretch of highway flanked by skeletal trees. The only sound was the rhythmic thwack-thwack of the windshield wipers. Then, a pair of headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. They were high, wide apart. A truck? No, an SUV. Black. It didn't pass her. It sat on her bumper, the high beams reflecting off her mirrors and searing into her retinas. Sarah accelerated, her heart hammering. The SUV accelerated with her. Then came the first impact, a sickening crunch of metal on metal. The sedan fishtailed, the tires screaming as they fought for grip on the slick asphalt. Sarah gasped, her chest tightening. The SUV hit her again, harder this time, aiming for the rear quarter panel. The world spun. The car left the road, the headlights sweeping across the dark trees before a violent jolt sent Sarah's head into the side window. The sound of breaking glass was like a gunshot. The sedan tumbled into a deep roadside ditch, the world tilting and crashing until it came to a rest at a sharp angle. Silence. Then the smell of scorched dust and leaking fluids. Sarah's head throbbed, a dull, rhythmic ache. She touched her temple and felt something warm and sticky. Blood. She looked toward the road. The black SUV had stopped. A door opened, the interior light casting a long shadow across the grass. She couldn't stay here. She scrambled for the passenger side, kicking the door open. She grabbed the laptop and a tire iron from the floorboard. As she crawled out of the wreckage, the heavy boots of the driver crunched on the gravel above. The man from the motel. He didn't rush. He moved with the confidence of someone who had already won. Sarah didn't wait. She ran into the tall grass of a nearby field, the wet stalks slapping against her legs. She could hear him behind her, a steady, relentless pace. She saw a shape in the darkness. An old farm truck parked near a rusted gate. It looked like a relic, but it was her only chance. She reached the door and pulled. Locked. Sarah didn't hesitate. She swung the tire iron, the metal shattering the driver's side window with a satisfying crash. She reached in, unlocked the door, and dived into the cabin. It smelled of old hay and motor oil. She ripped the panel under the steering wheel, her fingers finding the wires by touch. She had seen her brother do this a dozen times when they were kids. Spark, spark, roar. The old engine coughed a cloud of blue smoke and came to life. Sarah slammed it into gear just as the mercenary reached the gate. She floored it, the truck bouncing over the uneven ground, the headlights flickering as she sped away into the night. Subverted, safe. She was finally safe, or at least she had a lead. The farm truck was a tank compared to her sedan, and the mercenary was left standing in the dust. Sarah's mind began to work again, the auditor of souls returning to her post. She needed to know the extent of David's reach. She reached into the glove box, hoping for a map or a weapon. Her hand closed around a thick, legal-sized folder. Sarah pulled it out, her heart lifting. This was it. The farmer must have been one of David's associates, or perhaps David had used this truck himself. She flipped it open, the interior light of the truck casting a dim, yellow glow over the pages. "Yes," she whispered, a smile touching her bloody lips. The documents were property deeds, tax records, bank statements. It was the smoking gun she had been searching for. She saw the address for the Richmond house, the one she had seen on the video feed. She saw the transfers of millions of dollars, offshore accounts, shell companies, the works. Her reasoning was perfect. David was sloppy, and he had left the evidence right where a desperate woman could find it. She felt a surge of triumph so strong it made her lightheaded. She had him. She would take this to the feds, and David would spend the rest of his life in a gray room. She relaxed, her shoulders dropping for the first time in hours. She even let out a small, jagged laugh. The crisis was over. She just had to get to a police station. Then she saw the signature at the bottom of the lead deed. Sarah Miller. She blinked, pulling the paper closer to her eyes. It wasn't just a forgery. It was a masterpiece. Every loop of the S, every sharp line of the M. It was her handwriting. She flipped to the next page. An application for a multi-million-dollar loan. Sarah Miller. A statement of assets, claiming her inheritance as collateral for the Richmond property. Sarah Miller. The crack in her victory was a cold realization that spread through her veins like ice water. This wasn't David's evidence. This was her frame. The documents didn't show David laundering money. They showed Sarah laundering money. They showed a wife who had grown greedy, who had used her husband's firm to hide her own illicit gains. The Richmond house wasn't David's secret family home in the eyes of the law. It was Sarah's primary asset in a massive real estate fraud scheme. The reveal hit her harder than the car crash. David hadn't been hiding the money from her. He had been moving it through her. He had systematically turned her into the primary suspect for federal crimes. If she went to the police with this folder, she wouldn't be the whistleblower. She would be the confession. She looked at the laptop on the seat beside her. The encryption keys she had fought so hard for? They weren't keys to his prison cell. They were the digital signatures that would prove she was the architect of the entire collapse. The truck's engine sputtered, a reminder that she was running on fumes in more ways than one. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was the most wanted woman in the state. And the only person who could prove her innocence was the man who had just finished burying her alive. Part 3. No way out. The storm had turned the world into a landscape of gray and brown. Sarah pushed the old farm truck as hard as she dared, the steering wheel vibrating with a violence that made her teeth ache. She was nearing Richmond, but the map on the laptop showed a terrifying reality. The main bridge, the only direct route to the Craftsman house, was gone. The river had swollen into a churning, coffee-colored monster, swallowing the asphalt and leaving only a jagged gap of rushing water. Sarah slammed her fist against the dashboard. No, 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 no. She looked at the screen. There was a thin, winding line that cut through the woods. A hunting trail. It was a detour that would take her miles out of her way, through terrain the truck wasn't built for, but it was the only way left. She turned off the main road, the tires immediately sinking into the deep, viscous mud. The air smelled of wet pine and rot. The high-pitched whine of cicadas was a constant, maddening loop, drowning out the sound of the engine. Every tree along the path had a small, identical X carved into the bark. It felt like a warning. The truck groaned. The wheels spun, throwing up plumes of filth, but the mud was too deep. With a final, pathetic shudder, the engine died. Sarah sat in the silence for a moment, her breath hitching in her chest. 1,502. 1,503. She grabbed the laptop and the folder, wrapping them in her coat to keep them dry. She stepped out into the rain, her feet sinking to the ankles in the sludge. She walked. The woods were a labyrinth of reaching branches and hidden roots. She tripped, the laptop bag swinging and hitting a tree with a sickening thud. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The distant wail of a siren drifted through the trees, not for her, not yet, but a reminder that time was a luxury she didn't have. She reached the edge of the woods and saw it. The Craftsman house. It was beautiful in a sterile, haunting way. The blue paint was peeling slightly, and the porch light flickered with a rhythmic, dying pulse. Sarah moved toward the porch, her muscles seizing from the cold. She just needed to get inside. She needed to find Chloe. She needed to find the truth before David found her. I wondered how long it would take you. The voice was like a velvet knife. Sarah froze. David stepped out of the shadows of the porch. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a heavy work jacket, his jawline sharp in the flickering light. He didn't look like a husband. He looked like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "David," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "You always were the smart one, Sarah. Too smart for your own good." He stepped down into the mud, his boots crunching on the gravel. "Did you like the folder? I thought the signatures were a nice touch. You killed me," she said, the realization hitting her all over again. "You erased me." David laughed, a short, sharp sound that had no warmth in it. "I didn't erase you, Sarah. I perfected you. You're the auditor, remember? You're the one who finds the mistakes. I just gave you a whole life of them to fix." He lunged. Sarah tried to turn, but the mud held her fast. David's hand closed around her throat, his thumb pressing into her windpipe. He slammed her back against a tree, the rough bark biting into her spine. "Give me the laptop, Sarah," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "Give me the keys, and maybe I'll let you run. Maybe I'll give you a head start before the police get here." He grunted, his grip loosening for a split second. She managed to bring her knee up, catching him in the thigh. He grunted, his grip loosening for a split second. She twisted away, stumbling toward the rain-swollen creek at the edge of the property. The water was a roar in her ears. David was right behind her. He tackled her, and they both went down into the mud. It was a primitive, ugly struggle. Sarah fought with everything she had, her fingers gouging at his eyes, her teeth sinking into his hand. David was stronger, his weight pinning her down into the cold, wet earth. "You're a stalker, Sarah," he whispered, his voice dripping with mock pity. "A disgruntled employee who couldn't handle the divorce. You came here to hurt my new family. That's what I told the dispatcher. That's what the world is going to believe." The sirens were louder now. "They were close. You have nothing," David said, his eyes cold and unblinking. "No money, no name, no future. You're just a ghost in the mud." He pulled a heavy metallic object from his pocket, the silver key to the house. He pressed it against her cheek, the cold metal a mockery of a caress. "Goodbye, Sarah." Part 4. Escape and Resolution. The sirens were a physical weight now, the blue and red lights reflecting off the wet leaves of the trees. David stood up, wiping the mud from his jacket with a practiced, arrogant flick of his wrist. He looked toward the driveway, a smile of triumph spreading across his face. Sarah lay in the mud, her chest heaving. She felt the weight of the laptop beneath her, the hard casing a silent witness to her failure. But her fingers weren't on the laptop. They were on her wrist. The auditor of souls had one more entry to make. "You think you won?" Sarah croaked, her voice barely audible over the rain. David turned, his expression one of bored amusement. "I know I won, Sarah. Look around. You're the one in the dirt." "I'm sorry, David," she said. She wasn't counting this time. She was speaking to the small, hidden microphone in her watch, a piece of text she'd bought months ago when the first discrepancies had appeared. "I'm sorry I didn't do this sooner." David stepped closer, his curiosity piqued by her tone. "Do what?" "You have nothing." "I have you," she said. "Tell me again, David. Tell me how you forged the signatures. Tell me how you moved the $50 million to Blue Ridge Holdings. I want to hear it one last time before the police take me away." David laughed, a deep, resonant sound. He leaned in, his face inches from hers, his voice a low, confident growl. "Fine. I'll give you that much. I used the administrative override to revoke your credentials. I routed the traffic through the secondary system, and I used your own perfect handwriting to sign the death warrant for your inheritance. It was easy, Sarah. You were so busy looking at the cents that you missed the millions. And Chloe? She was the perfect distraction. A woman who needed a savior and a man who needed a ghost." He straightened up, adjusting his tie. "There. Satisfied? Now, stay in the mud where you belong." Sarah didn't stay in the mud. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, silver earring, the one she had been wearing since the motel. With a practiced, nimble motion she had learned during a rebellious summer in her teens, she slid the thin metal post into the lock of the handcuffs David had produced from his jacket. Click! The metal fell away. Sarah stood up, her posture returning to its rigid, uncompromising state. She opened the laptop, her fingers flying across the keys. She didn't look at David. She looked at the Guardian Link app. "What are you doing?" David demanded, his voice sharpening with sudden unease. "I'm broadcasting," Sarah said. She hit the send key. The recording from her watch, the clear, arrogant confession of David Miller, began to play. It didn't just play on her laptop. It played through the Guardian Link app, which was synced to every board member's phone, every security terminal at the firm, and the dashboard of the approaching police cruisers. David's face drained of color. The pop, pop, pop of his knuckles was the only sound in the sudden silence. The police cars swerved into the driveway, their tires throwing up gravel. Officers dived out, their weapons drawn. "Sarah Miller?" one of them shouted. "I'm here," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear. "And I have the evidence you need." David tried to run, but the mud he had mocked her for now claimed him. He stumbled, his expensive boots losing their grip. The officers were on him in seconds, the silver handcuffs clicking into place with a finality that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. "Sorry about that, sir," Officer Stephen Brooks muttered as he bumped David's shoulder, his habit of apologizing to the world still intact even as he arrested a felon. Sarah watched as they led him away. She felt a hand on her shoulder. She flinched, but the touch was soft, hesitant. It was Chloe. The woman from the video feed looked older in person, her eyes filled with a weary, hollow light. She wasn't holding a baby. She was holding a folder of her own. "He told me you were dead," Chloe whispered. "He told me he was the only one left." "He lied to everyone," Sarah said. "I know," Chloe said. She handed Sarah the folder. "I've been working with a private investigator for 3 years. I knew he was laundering money. I just didn't know whose it was. I was waiting for him to slip up. I was waiting for someone to find us. Sarah looked at the folder. It contained birth certificates, travel logs, and a history of family abandonment that stretched back a decade. Chloe hadn't been a mistress. She had been a prisoner of a different kind, a woman trapped by the same master of lies. "We have him," Chloe said. The sun began to break through the clouds, casting a pale, watery light over the Richmond house. The auditor of souls looked at the mess around her, the mud, the wreckage, the shattered pieces of her life. The ledger was still out of balance, but for the first time in her life, Sarah didn't feel the need to apologize for it. 3 months later, Sarah sat on the porch of a small, modern house overlooking the Pacific coast. The air smelled of salt and wild jasmine. The only sound was the rhythmic, thunderous boom of the surf hitting the rocks below. She had sold the house in Arlington. She had reclaimed her inheritance through a series of grueling, precise court battles that had left the firm's board of directors trembling. She was now the head of a major tech firm in Silicon Valley, a woman whose reputation for surgical precision was no longer a joke, but a badge of honor. She checked her watch. It had been exactly 1 hour since her last meeting. She didn't click her tongue. She didn't count the seconds. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, dried rosebud, the one Martha had dropped in the motel room. She looked at it for a moment, then let it go. The wind caught the fragile petals, carrying them out over the cliff and into the vast, blue expanse of the ocean. The ticking clock in her head was finally silent. The debt was paid. Sarah Miller leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and listened to the sound of a world that no longer needed her to be perfect. The end.